So we got a few weeks left, including today. So there'll just be 2 more classes after this. So next we'll do apocalyptic literature, which will be kind of Revelation, some of Daniel. It'll overlap a lot with some of the prophetic books we went over, but we'll go over some things in there. And then I'm thinking we might have one last class on just tools and commentaries and kind of sorting through how do I figure out those things. But today we'll be talking about interpreting wisdom literature. And when we talk about wisdom literature, these are the 4 books we're typically referring to. Let me move over. But these are the 4 books that we're typically referring to when we talk about the wisdom books or the wisdom literature. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and the Song of Solomon. Just to make y'all aware, they are different types of wisdoms, which is why if you've read them, they're very different flavors, so to speak, very different styles, very different approaches, even though they're all wisdom literature. Proverbs is particularly proverbial wisdom. Proverbs are meant to be spoken, to be heard, easily remembered, passed on. They're meant to be kind of for daily life, for people to easily remember things. Ecclesiastes and Job are more speculative wisdom. They're based off life experience and observation, speculating, hey, this is what we could see and our experience, and this is what the wisdom we get from that. Then Song of Solomon is lyrical wisdom. It's this idea of really wisdom captured in song and rhyme and meter to be passed on, but also to be felt and not just said. So it's this wisdom of worship and celebration. To be really practical, when it comes to wisdom, I think it's important to talk about how does the Bible talk about wisdom? And I think the best definition is that wisdom is ultimately how to live rightly in God's world. God made the world. How do you live rightly in God's world? And that includes, how do you enjoy God's world? How do you live in righteousness in God's world? How do you live so you don't destroy yourself in God's world? How do you live in God's world even though it became broken because of sin and humanity? But wisdom really has to do with really practical living. And so one thing when it comes to wisdom literature is there's a lot of wisdom in it that's not, what we would call particularly religious. But it's religious in the sense of this is the way that God created the world. And when we find out of wisdom, is practical for living in it. And kind of different of the cultures of the day, what really differentiates the Old Testament is setting that up, that you can find other ancient cultures that will have many similar proverbs to things you'll see in Old Testament wisdom literature. But the difference is that the Old Testament happens within the context of living before God and a righteous God who's sovereign, who rules over the world. And that wisdom isn't just a matter of knowing all the right answers, but actually living before God and knowing your place in his world. So we're going to see those different types of wisdom, and that's why you'll kind of notice they have very different, like I said, flavors or styles and approaches in these books. So to talk about those in particular, Proverbial wisdom teaches people how to skillfully and practically live in God's ordered world through short, memorable observations and instructions. That's why you read the book of Proverbs. There are definitely sections that go together, but it can move from one topic to the next and one verse to the next, because these are a lot of things that parents and societies and wise men of the kings would have passed down in cultures where a lot of people were not literate, but still needed to live wisely. And so they would have come up with sayings, things that rhymed, things that were easy to remember. The same reason we have Proverbs in our culture, and almost really in every culture. And so that's what proverbial wisdom actually is and what it's designed to do. Then when it comes to speculative wisdom, that wrestles with life's difficult questions by reflecting on human experience, considering God's sovereignty. And so Job and Ecclesiastes both really wrestle with that question. If God's really good and just and rules over the world, why does it just seem things are just so messed up or don't work out the right way all the time? And so Ecclesiastes and Job are really wrestling with those questions and saying, okay, we know who God is, and yet this is how I see the world. And it just seems from our standpoint that oftentimes things are unfair, random, unclear. Bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. Like what's happening here in our experience based on what we know about who God is and if he really rules over the world. So it wrestles with those questions of putting our human experience alongside God's character. And then lastly, lyrical wisdom. Lyrical wisdom expresses God's truth through poetic reflection, worship, and meditation on life before God. And so it's an attempt to really put some beauty on wisdom, so to speak, as it spreads. So these are the types of wisdom that you'll kind of see expressed or described in those. Any questions or thoughts or comments so far on the different types of wisdom? Something I'll say too, I think I said it last class, but some of the Psalms are really proverbial than they are strictly a psalm. Some of them are lyrical wisdoms. Just know that there's proverbs other than strictly in wisdom in this book. Some of the narratives will have proverbs or sayings. Some of the Psalms do. So you'll find them. Even Jesus utilizes it at times. Where he'll make pithy or things that people will remember. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit. I think it's important to realize what's really the origin of wisdom literature. Like, why does it exist? How did it come into the Bible? And, the simplistic answer in one way is because God wanted it. He wanted us to know that wisdom. But kind of historically, how did it come into being? How did it form? And there's really two main ways. The first one, and you can kind of see it in the development of the Bible, is these people called wise men. So in the ancient Near East, in cultures that started to form, societies that started to form, monarchies, it became very common for kings and pharaohs and different people to have a council of people with them who would help them counsel and rule over the people. And you can start to see that even through the scriptures. One of the earliest signs is Genesis 45:8. It's talking about Joseph becomes essentially a wise counselor to Pharaoh. That he kind of is a figure that becomes this counselor, to Pharaoh with wisdom. And so there's mention of these wise men throughout the scriptures. And so just know it would have been common for Israelite culture, but even surrounding nations, to often the king to be surrounded by men that was essentially their job, was to pursue wisdom, to often collect it and find it in writings and act as sort of a counsel for the king when he needed to make decisions about taxes or war or law or whatever it may be. They would be his counselors. And some of the kings would have like hundreds of guys doing the counsel. You can see Daniel kind of becomes that in the book of Daniel to the king of Babylon as well, him and his friends. He becomes one of the top counselors or magistrates to the king as he interprets his dreams. And so that's part of the origin of it, of how did we end up with these books. It was probably some of those wise men over many years collecting this wisdom, these sayings, and then passing it on and writing it down. So that's one way. And then the second common way was really the wisdom of the home. Not much unlike today. I don't know, it depends who you're talking to, speaking of generations, I guess. But most of the time, most of us, where do we get our wisdom from, or lack of? It was in our home. We assumed that our parents were correct in their understanding of the world and that they knew everything, at least till a certain age. And so we just took what they told us. And some of our parents were wise, some less so. But we can see that in the development of Scripture as well. And often what you'll see in those verses is that wisdom literature is often set in this context of almost like a family. And even if technically the writers, they might not technically not be talking to their kid, they're going to express it in a way almost like a father talking to his son or a mother talking to her daughter. And that's because it was just very common that for most people, their education, particularly in the ancient world, didn't come from schooling or things like that. It came from your parents. You probably did the job of your parents. You learned your skills from your parents. You learned language from your parents. That's where you got educated. And so much of it just comes from the wisdom of the home as parents passed on to their children most naturally. As family units were together and tribes and had patriarchal figures that were heads of those families, and they passed on wisdom. So as far as the wisdom literature goes, those are probably really the two main sources of how we ended up with this. Is society kind of naturally collected this wisdom, and then also there was people actually high up in that society tasked with making sure to teach people this wisdom, but particularly those who are of a high social class, learning from them as wise men. And we even see that at the birth of Christ, as the Magi come and wise men from Babylon. And that's the idea. These were learned men who knew wisdom, and they understood, possibly from what Daniel taught them long ago, that something was supposed to happen as far as astronomy goes. And when they saw Christ's star, there they were. So there they appear. And actually, fun fact, it probably wasn't 3 of them. It was probably many more of them. The Bible never actually mentions 3. It was probably more like 60 to 100 of them that came to see Christ with the way these things worked. So, but we typically come to the conclusion of 3 because it mentions 3 gifts: frankincense, myrrh, and gold. But I think that's how we arrived at 3. But there was probably actually a lot more, which makes more sense why Herod knew that they were there. He saw the caravan come into town on their camels, carrying their gifts and all these things. It would have been probably a pretty obvious sight to everyone as these people came into the town. So that's the origin of wisdom literature. And like I said, I think it sets us up well, particularly the wisdom of the home, why you're going to read so much about fathers, daughters, mothers, father figures, mother figures, and it being set in that context. Even if technically the writer's not talking to it, they're setting it up that way because people would have understand that's how wisdom gets passed on from parental type figures. So let's talk about principles for interpreting wisdom literature. In some ways, I think wisdom literature is one of the easiest because it's something that carries a lot even into our culture now. We still have Proverbs. There's still the idea of living wisely, prudently, shrewdly, whether it be with money or just in business, in your social life, all these things. And so a lot of it carries over. And then a lot of the things I think that are said in the wisdom literature, even the examples and allegories are used, are still things we understand because there's basic units of life. We understand like what it means to be a sluggard and to sleep a lot. We understand even metaphors of if you don't work, then you're not going to eat because you're not going to make anything. For them, it was harvesting, but you're not going to make any money. We understand ideas of marriage and adultery, these types of things, submission to authority and authorities over us, the frustration of paying taxes, the frustrations of getting old. These are all things we understand. So a lot of it translates, but we also want to be careful that we don't abuse them, and they do get abused in some ways. So we'll talk about that. But this one was supposed to be first, so we'll go back. First principle that you want to use in interpreting wisdom literature is remember that wisdom is meant to teach living rightly in God's world. It's really this idea of you're always living before God. He sees you at every moment. This is his world. He created it. He knows how it works. He knows what will destroy us. He knows what's good for us. He sees all ends. He knows how all things end, and we don't. And I think it's just really important we remember that when it comes to the wisdom literature, that's what it's trying to teach us. Remember, you're always living before God. And if you want to do well before God, this is how you need to live. So some places we see that in. Proverbs 1:7 begins with this, repeats it a couple times. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so if you want to be someone who's lines, it begins with the fear of God, understanding your place before God. And I'll say this, I think the fear of the Lord both means reverence and actual fear. I think some Christians cop out on that. And they're like, well, it doesn't actually mean like fear God. And I'm like, it does. It's also the same word used for terror in the Bible. And so I think it means both, that there is this sense of holy reverence and respect we have for God and his position and who he is and being far beyond us. But there is a sense that should grip us like, God holds my life and he can end it at any moment he wants. And oftentimes how much it would serve us to do well as Christians to know like that God is sovereign, God sees, and how the fear of God in those moments and God's even discipline. You know, he doesn't judge or condemn Christians. In Christ, we're free from condemnation. We're free from judgment because ultimately our judgment's not based on our works anymore, but Christ's works. But he does discipline us. Paul even talks about in Corinthians when it comes to communion, some people were taking communion in an unworthy manner and God kills them. He says, you're done. Shows us how serious God took the Lord's Supper. But we want to live with genuine fear before him. And then just fear of like, I think it goes with God talks about, look, there'll be consequences if you disobey that. Yes, you may be blessed with eternal life, but you're going to have natural consequences to your actions. You live in a sowing and reaping world. And so part of fearing the Lord is knowing when God says in scripture, like, your sin will find you out. You can't hide it. It's going to happen. Of believing God when he says that. Things are going to come back. Another one, Job 28:28. And he said to the man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. And so again, this concept of fearing the Lord or living before God. And Ecclesiastes ends with this, at the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And one of the things I love about Ecclesiastes is people often read this verse and they think of all the bad things they might do and God bringing them into judgment. But so much of Ecclesiastes, actually the author spends time telling us that God's going to actually judge us if we don't actually enjoy the good things. That he says, look, God's going to ask you, what did you do with your youth? Did you enjoy that? Were you thankful for the gift of youth? Not everyone lived to be young. Did you, like, even simple things like, did you enjoy nature? Did you ride a bike? Did you enjoy like having friends? Did you try to be kind to people? He talks about other parts of enjoying your spouse if you have one, enjoying your friendships, enjoying food, all these things. And that's kind of the message of Ecclesiastes in a nutshell is if you try to treat life like it's something you earn or are owed, you're not going to get much out of life. But if you accept life for what it is, a gift, it's not going to be all great all the time, but you'll be able to actually enjoy it because that's what it is. It's God's gift to you. Working, money, food, drink, friendships, marriage, it's God's gift to you. And you never know when it's going to be taken. You never know when it's going to be given. So just enjoy what you have with thankfulness in your hearts to the Lord. And this is God's gift to you. He wants you to enjoy it. And so Ecclesiastes, as it ends, as it says that, it's calling that into account. If you've been giving these things, God's going to call us into account. Did you enjoy the gifts that I gave you? And we're expected to do that. So that's why I think Christians, it's not wrong to be sad. It's not wrong to be even depressed at times, but we should have the full range of emotions. There should be times in our life that are filled with joy, times where it's right to grieve, and everything in between. Times where it's right to be angry, wrong to be angry, whatever it may be. So that's living rightly in God's world. And then next, one thing you guys want to remember is Proverbs are not promises. This is where people get themselves in the most trouble with wisdom literature. Proverbs are not promises. Wisdom literatures are not God's promises. They're truisms. They're generally true, but that's not always the case. And that's some of what Job and Ecclesiastes wrestles with. It's not always the case that the wise guy wins. It's not always the case the nice guy wins. It's not always the guys win. And what's up with that? And so Job and Ecclesiastes are wrestling with that in their speculative wisdom. But we just need to know that just because the wisdom says, hey, this is the wise way, wisdom is not you do A and you get B. It doesn't always turn out that way, but it's generally true. And at the end, you will be judged. We will stand before the Lord, and he'll judge us for whatever situation that we were in and what knowledge that we had. So as you go to the Bible, some passages that speak to that, or an example of that. This is a common one. Train up a child the way he should go, even when he's old, when he won't depart from it. Is that generally true? Well, yeah. Is that true all the time? No. Everyone who's already got grown kids. Yeah, it's like sometimes you have multiple kids. One's saved, one's on fire, knows the Lord. The other one hates the Lord and just can't get it together. And they lived in the same house. They got the same instruction and the same thing. And so this isn't a promise from God that if you raise your kids in the right way, that you're going to get a great kid. And so sometimes wonderful parents who are extremely faithful have kids that go wayward, and it's not their fault. And sometimes there's people who are not faithful parents, and they have a kid who's great. And that's the grace of God. But it doesn't mean that you should try to be a bad parent just because some kids turned out okay. But it also means that sometimes as parents, we need to be understand they just can't control everything. And they have their main decisions. They have to stand before the Lord one day on their own. And our job is to pass on as much wisdom as we can. But yeah, when parents start turning this into the promise, it gets frustrating. They get angry. God, I did all the things. I brought them to church. I taught them the Bible. We did all the devotions at home. We sung the music. And they just get frustrated when they need to be able to understand this is not a promise, generally true, generally good, but there's other proverbs and other things in the scripture that would speak to the reality of why children might go awry even after those things. Job 2:10, one of my favorite verses that almost never gets quoted, but this is Job's seemingly last wife who's alive, talking to him after he loses everything else. And do you hold fast to your integrity, curse God, and die? Job, why are you still blessing God? You just lost everything. And Job said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God and shall not receive evil? And all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So Job's point is, look, I see all the blessings from God. Should I not receive calamity or wrong things? Like, does God owe me all these things? And how many times as Christians we could have that perspective of, I was sitting with a group at my house and we were kind of talking about this idea of, Jesus hasn't come to promise me the upper middle class American lifestyle. I'm like, where we live and where Hannah and I right now, we feel extremely blessed. But I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to have all this. God can take this away in a moment. And so I'm going to do what Ecclesiastes says. I'm going to enjoy it for what it is. And then I'm going to listen to the wisdom of Job, even though it would be extremely difficult as it was for Job. As God takes it away, that's his prerogative. He didn't promise me this. He didn't promise a kosher, comfortable life for me. And so I think that's a great verse that just exemplifies that Job realizes, look, he lived wisely. He did what was right. He didn't sin with his lips. And yet everything was stripped for him for reasons he didn't know. That's one of the things about Job. We know about the whole conversation between Satan and God. Job didn't know. He didn't know any of that. We'll talk more about Job a little bit later in particular. And then Ecclesiastes 9:11, again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. That just seemingly random things happen where it doesn't always work out like you would expect it to work out. And that's part of the reality of life. and that Ecclesiastes is observing. Like, these aren't always promises that if you live wisely, that everything's going to go okay. All right. Number 3, I think I have 5 of these, is consider the collective context, which is a lot what we've been talking about in the other books of considering the context, but particularly for wisdom literature, just knowing the verses around it. Even in Proverbs, there's sections that are really meant to go together and that build on one another. So one example, throughout Proverbs, you see a pretty consistent theme of 2 women are constantly presented, because it's as if this father's talking to a son. And there's one woman called Folly, and there's one woman called Wisdom. And this theme just occurs again and again and again, where he's exhorting his son, marry and be united to Lady Wisdom, not to Lady Folly. And there's going to be there's going to be 2 paths in your lives. And if you marry Folly, it's going to be sure destruction. You marry Wisdom, maybe not everything goes okay all the time, but you're going to be able to enjoy and handle life way better than the self-destruction that Folly is going to bring you into. And so we want to consider the collective context when we read wisdom literature. This is a great example, verses that go together, and it's even longer if you go before chapter 6. But can a man carry fire next to his chest in his clothes and not be burned? Or can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So is he who goes into his neighbor's wife. None who touches her will go unpunished. And even before this, he has a section about talking about not going to the prostitute's house. And so the whole section is this extended metaphor and allegory, really, of telling his son, warning him about unfaithfulness. You will bring ruin on your life, son, if you are unfaithful in marriage. Don't do it. It's like trying to carry fire next to your clothes. You're gonna get burned. You will be punished. You will have consequences. It's like walking on hot coals. You're gonna get scorched. So those things go together to show us and kind of build up that this is what he's focusing on. He's trying to talk to his son about sexual fidelity and how significant that is, and how much destruction that will bring to his life if he doesn't stay in that. Ecclesiastes 10:19. People often ask me, like, "What's your favorite verse?" This is what I tell them. They're always like, "That is that really in the Bible?" Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Right? But as you read that collective context in chapter 10, there's some trueness to this, and even looking at it in isolation, we can see that. But in the wider context, Solomon's really exhorting these gifts of life and how to enjoy them. And so he's not saying that you should be a glutton and just stuff yourself with bread and all you ever want. He's not saying you should be a drunkard and just drink all you want. Nor that necessarily that money will solve every problem you have, but it does solve a lot of problems. So that's why he says it. But it's in the wider context of being able to enjoy your life. And so he's exhorting in that passage to do just that. But taken in isolation, it could be really hurtful. And then Solomon 4:4, which just cracks me up. This is the man talking to a woman. If you never read Song of Solomon, it's a romance story. The Bible is a romance story. But he says to this woman that he's going to marry, your neck is like the Tower of David, built in rows of stone. On it hang 1,000 shields, and all of them shields of warriors. Oh, what a beautiful thing, right, girls? You're like, oh, yeah, take me home, honey. What a beautiful poem you wrote for me. But again, if you read the context of Solomon 4, as this guy speaks to his bride-to-be, you'd understand he's describing both the physical and the character of his future wife and what he admires about her. And that really, this in its original context, both historically and the Song of Solomon, essentially what he's saying is she carries herself with grace and dignity. That's what he's saying about her. That on top of her neck sits a head of great and dignity, just like this Tower of David built in stone. It's this thing that's surefire and stands firm, that it hangs 1,000 shields. That's where the warriors hang their shields after battle, after honorable times. And so he's saying, what grace and dignity that my lover carries herself with, which is a lot more complimentary to us. There's some other interesting things that Solomon and her say back and forth to one another that to us, you're like, wow, that's an interesting compliment. But when we come to understand the context, it helps us out a lot. So we see that in Song of Solomon. Number 4, wisdom will often be universal but not precise. Universal but not precise. A lot of wisdom literature is meant to be orally passed down by word of mouth and to be remembered. It's a truism. They're not meant to be pinpoint precise all the time. It's meant to be remembered so you can carry with it. And we have proverbs like that in our culture, that there's plenty of proverbs we say that they're not meant to be exactly precise. An apple away keeps the apple a day keeps the doctor away. What do we mean by that? Do you literally have to eat an apple every day? No, we just mean you eat healthy, you're probably going to live healthy. And there's tons of other sayings we have. So just know they're meant to be universal and not precise. So some examples of that: a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. This is something we've tried to teach my son. And sometimes as parents, we're not so good at this because you get angry at your kids. But sometimes even if he's angry and we speak a soft answer back, he don't always answer back soft. So it's just not always true. But generally, is this true? Yeah, you have a lot better chance of abating someone's anger when you just answer back kindly and softly. Ecclesiastes 10:10, if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. What is it saying? Universally, do knowledge and skill make things easier? Heck yeah, they do. If you have the knowledge and skill, does it always succeed in making that thing better? Not always. So again, a universal principle, but there's always exceptions to a lot of the Proverbs. And so we need to know that. Or Solomon 2:7, do not stir or awaken love until it pleases. But the question becomes, well, when is the right time? And as you read the Song of Solomon, there's no age, there's no particular season, there's no stage that it says. It just says not before until it pleases. And so, again, it's this universal principle of, hey, there's a time that it's not ready for someone who's not ready to be romantically involved or near marriage. And there comes a times where they are. But precisely where that is probably going to change from person to person, from culture to culture, from place to place. So it doesn't give that preciseness, but it's universally recognized that, yeah, there's a time when it's no, that is not appropriate, and there's a time when it is. There's a time when it's foolish, and there's a time when it's wise. And then the 5th one, and this is kind of a unique one, but the gospel of Jesus Christ duly intensifies wisdom. And I just didn't have a great example for this at the moment. I need to bring one to the next class. But what we need to know is we read the wisdom literature, we often wrestle with two sides. When it comes to the gospel and the good news of Jesus and who Jesus is, and you guys have probably experienced this, in some ways, being a Christian makes life easier, and in other ways, it makes it more difficult than it was. And when it comes to the gospel and we get to the New Testament with the wisdom writings, we're going to see a lot of that come to fruition. There's this double prong. It makes the harder harder and the easier easier. It makes the lighter lighter and the heavier heavier. And so there's always sort of two sides of the coin when it comes to wisdom and looking at both things. And the gospel's answer is usually not to try to meet them in the middle. It's actually to intensify them in both directions. So I guess an example off the top of my head as we read Ecclesiastes of like, not everything's always fair. In one way, the gospel makes that easier because we know we don't want fair. I got grace and mercy from God, and I don't want God's judgment, and I'm so thankful for that. But at the same time, it intensifies it because now I know who God is and how good and merciful and gracious He is, and yet I have to live in this messed up, broken world where people are going to treat me so unfairly, and yet God calls me to treat them with goodness and with grace, not revile evil. So it intensifies both of like, I know who God is and how contrary some of the things that are happening to me are against His character, and yet I have to suffer and do good to others. And yet that suffering simultaneously becomes more bearable because I know of God's grace and kindness to me. And you could go down a list of so much wisdom, and you'll see how the gospel just intensifies it in both directions. And so as Christians, we just need to be really comfortable. This is both true in the way we live and in what we believe with tension. So much of the Christian life is holding things in tension. Tension that God is simultaneously merciful and just. To some people, He doesn't give them what they deserve. To some people, He gives them exactly what they deserve. That God is simultaneously near to us and knowable, and yet so transcendent and above and beyond us. That life simultaneously can seem so unfair and so random and so cruel, and yet so precious and so good and so joyful. And those things exist side by side. And so the gospel, and when you get to the New Testament, I think really helps to intensify both of those things for us. And it's why I think Paul can say things like all the wisdom of God is ultimately found in Christ, that it makes its way back to Christ. He helps us to make sense of both sides of the coin of wisdom. And really, like I said, wisdom literature often doesn't resolve the tension for us, and the gospel even seems to make the tension worse or more at odds with one another, so to speak. So, any questions on those principles when it comes to wisdom literature? Any questions? Hopefully those are helpful as you come to them. But yeah, I think those are the principles that will really help you guys. Some of the other basic things we've learned as well, right? There's going to be metaphor, there's going to be expressions, there's going to be idioms. And so just trying to look past those and see those, just like in our own Proverbs, that oftentimes it's talking beyond just the literal things that it's mentioning. So the last thing I wanted to do is kind of just, what time are we at? Okay, we got a little bit longer. Just give you guys some heads up about some of the things in each of these books that might be helpful. Just things that personally I've learned over the years that I'm kind of like, I wish somebody just would have kind of told me this or about it. First is with Proverbs. I think one of those most important ones is don't turn every proverb into a promise. It's general living. Know that Proverbs is going to be set up like a father talking to a son and giving wisdom. But know that a lot of the Proverbs do go together. And so I'd encourage you, as you read Proverbs, look for sections that kind of have a common theme or common thing coming together, and try to identify that. And then keep that big theme in your mind, that he's really setting up, as he's talking to his son, these two paths represented by these two women. He's just going to keep coming back to that theme. And the idea is to marry wisdom. And so much so, that's why personally, when you get to Proverbs 31, women, I don't think Proverbs 31 is actually an actual woman that existed that he's talking about. I think essentially Proverbs starts with talking about two women. And I think what Proverbs 31 is actually about is describing a woman as if she's real, that embodies what wisdom looks like. And oftentimes when women read Proverbs 31, they're like, well, I'm never going to be that. And the expectation's high. And I don't think you're supposed to be. If you actually read Proverbs 31, notice there's not a single command in Proverbs 31. Do this, don't do that. Just a description of this woman. And so essentially, if I could put it in a nutshell or summarize it, I think Proverbs 31, at that point, it's actually the mother, one of the moms speaking, is saying, son, marry wisdom. And this is what wisdom would look like in a real life. And that's what you need to be married to. And even as you read Proverbs 31, you're reading about a woman as being described as someone who's really at the post most of her motherhood duties and all that. Her children are already grown. They're out of house. That's why she can work and do all this stuff at home or buy vineyards for her husband. That wealth comes from her husband, that ability of time. She's already raised the kids and done all that. So I think it's particularly careful when we exhort young women to it. Proverbs 31 is more about how do I live as a wise woman than how do I just like copy this woman exactly. And that's more important about Proverbs. But you're just going to see that theme consistently throughout. When it comes to Ecclesiastes, I think some really helpful things is that oftentimes in Ecclesiastes, the author is going to shift between God's point of view and our point of view. He has this expression, under the sun, he constantly uses. It's this idea from a human standpoint, things look random, chaotic, unjust at times, unfair, but then sometimes every once in a while, he's going to prick through, so to speak. He's going to look from God's perspective. So no, he's just going to switch back and forth. Know that he's purposely trying to make you uncomfortable in a lot of what he's saying. And as Christians read Ecclesiastes, that's why it makes some of them very uncomfortable, what it says. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make you take a hard look at what life is really like and trying to reconcile that with who God is. And he does some of it for us, but he doesn't always, again, resolve that tension. He wants us to think about it. Another thing I'll point about Ecclesiastes, the most important word is vanity. He'll use it over and over and over again. Really what Ecclesiastes is chapters 1 through 11 and maybe into part of 12. It's really a sermon. And probably the best translation for that word is preacher or speaker. It's this idea, the Hebrew word is koheleth. He's the speaker of a people who've come together in an assembly. And so he's preaching this sermon to them. And knowing that he's going to use vivid images, he's trying to stoke people to respond and to reflect and to think. And I'll just encourage you as you read Ecclesiastes, don't ignore that. Christians need to wrestle with serious, hard questions. And I think having surface, lame answers, or even thinking that we know the answer to everything is just not helpful, even particularly in our evangelism sometimes, that people need to know that we're not people who ignore this, that there's real suffering, real hard things in the world. And part of the message of Ecclesiastes is at the end that God sees, God knows that he'll judge in his timing. But ultimately, like I said, it's that life's a gift. And if you try to treat life like you're trying to hold on to it, it's going to get away from you. And I think that's the best translation of vanity. Some of you, your translation might use the word meaningless. I think that's a bad translation. I don't think he's trying to say life is meaningless. And so if it really did mean that, wouldn't make any sense. I think what he's trying to say is life is fleeting. Life gets away from you. It's like trying to catch the air in your hand. He uses that expression. The word for vanity actually means like a vapor, a breath. Life is so brief and it just disappears. And so that's what he's describing. Life is brief, life is short. Life gets away from you. Learn to grasp it for the gift that it is, but eventually you're going to have to let things go. You're going to get old. Things are going to be taken away from you. Good things will come. Hard things will come. Joyous times will come. But just take what comes and try to enjoy what you can as God's gift to you in obedience to him. So I think that's just helpful in Ecclesiastes to know that sometimes he's not trying to look from God's perspective. He's really trying to look from ours. Another analogy that's sometimes helpful in Ecclesiastes is like if you think of a multiple story building. Sometimes he's on the first floor and he's kind of saying, hey, let's look out here and talk about what we see. And then we go up an elevator and we go to the second floor. He says, now let's look out and see what we see. Now you can see over some fences and some walls and things happening. And now let's go to God's level on the third level and see what you see, where God can see all of these things happening at once. And it gives us perspective on that. So that's really helpful for Ecclesiastes. Job is a really interesting book. Something that you're going to have to wrestle with that I don't think most Christians have considered is, if you don't know the plot of Job, Satan comes to God unknown to Job, says, I'm looking for someone to tempt. And God says, well, why not Job? And he says, well, Job only worships you because you give him everything. He's got his family, he's got his wealth, he got all that. And God says, fine, do anything but kill him. And I think he'll still serve me. And Satan does all those things. But most of Job then is, as Job suffers this tremendous loss, is Job's friends coming to him, trying to give him counsel. And basically their counsel is, Job, you did something wrong. You sinned. What did you do, Job? Repent. But then at the end of all this, God shows up, doesn't say much about Job's sin, but he helps Job understand. Essentially, God's answer to Job is, who do you think you are, Job? Like, where were you when I made the world? Where were you when I made the universe? You think I owe you an answer, Job? Like, that's God's answer. Like, I'm so much higher than you, Job. You think I need to give you an answer for everything? And Job, all Job can do is put his hand over his mouth and say nothing. Wise man. But the point is, at the end of that, God condemns all the advice of Job's friends. And so as you're reading that portion of scripture, you have to think to yourself, why did God condemn this advice? Because sometimes it sounds right. You're like, wow, I've heard my pastor say some of these things or some of these truths. And some of what they're saying are right. Most often of where they're wrong is they don't hold the tension well. They don't see God from multiple facets in multiple ways. They're trying to highlight one attribute of God, usually his justice, to try to say, Job, you did something wrong. That's why. But the author of Job tries to make painfully clear to us at the beginning and the end, there was no particular sin Job did that made him deserving of what happened to him. It's in the beginning, we learn about Job. God describes him as a blameless man, not sinless, blameless, meaning it's the same word in the New Testament for elders, above reproach. It's this idea of there was no blatant, open pattern of sin in Job's life. He did commit sins, but there was just no obvious rebellion, outright sin in his life. But we know he had sin because it describes in Job 1, he goes to offer sacrifices. Well, what is a sacrifice for sin? And Job was so worried about his kids, he would go to offer sacrifices on his kids' behalf in case they sinned and he didn't know about it. And then we read the verse earlier. It says, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And so it tries to make abundantly clear to us, Job didn't do anything particularly wrong. And so the message of Job is God's sovereignty over the world and understanding our place before him. This idea of God's ways are so much higher than us, and we don't always get an answer. But the answer isn't also that just because we suffer doesn't mean we did something wrong. We may have been faithful. God may have us exactly where he wants us, but we just don't know why. Job didn't know. We know because we're reading the story and the author tells us. But the same things are going to happen in our lives. There's going to be suffering, and we're just not going to know the pinpoint reason exactly why. We might know some broad reasons. God's working all things to conform us to the image of Christ, Romans 8:28 and 29. But why this trial? Why this right now? Why this suffering? It's God's prerogative that he doesn't have to tell us that every time. But we can trust God and that he has good purposes. And that's part of the message of Job as well. It's learning to trust God in those situations where you don't have an answer and you don't know why. And don't rush to answers like Job's friends did. Like, you must have done something wrong, and this is God's discipline. This is God's wrath on you. Sometimes that might be the case, but sometimes it's not. So I think that's really helpful for Job to just know as you're reading his friend's advice, it gets condemned later by God. So trying to kind of figure out, what did they miss? What are they getting wrong here? And usually it gets answered in Job's rebuttal, because God not only disapproves of their advice, he actually approves of Job's rebuttal, that he was right in what he said back to his friends. Random thing too that I think is a great part of Job. I just sent it to someone recently. But I think a lot of Christians, I'll just say it because it's been on my mind, need to hear it. At the end of Job 1, the one thing his friends did right is it said when they first found him, they saw his suffering was great, and they sat with him for days and said nothing. One of the best ways that we as Christians minister to people before we open our mouth is just suffer with people. If people are in tremendous loss or pain, yes, the gospel speaks into that. Yes, we want to tell them the truth. No, we don't keep our mouth closed forever. But sometimes we just need to keep our mouths shut and suffer alongside people. And so there's just some wisdom in that there's times and moments that, yes, we want to have urgency with the gospel. But also we want to learn to suffer well and know when is the time to open our mouth. So know that. And then lastly, Song of Solomon. I just want to make it really clear. It's very clear that it's about a romantic relationship between a man and wife. It's not some sort of allegory for Jesus and the church. It's not something like that. It's celebrating sexual love between a man and a woman, and it needs to be in the Bible, and it's good it's there. God created gender. God created us as embodied persons. God created sexuality as a good thing. And Song of Solomon speaks to that truth and celebrates the reality in worship of God creating sex and gender and marriage and monogamy, and that these are wonderful things that we should celebrate and enjoy. So it's a little bit unfortunate how many Christians have neglected this book, and even pastors. I said this in the other class before, but man, the world's going to be talking about sin and talking about sex. And if the church isn't, then that's who our kids are going to be listening to. That's who people in church are going to go to. If they're not going to get the wisdom from God about sexuality and who they are and their identity, then they're going to go elsewhere. And they're going to find the world's wisdom, and it's going to lead them to folly and destruction. And that's the reality of it. And so I hope as you guys read that it will be a book that you guys enjoy, that you think seriously too, if you're married, about the romance doesn't end in the dating, but continues on in the marriage. You see that in Song of Solomon as well. So yeah, I just encourage you guys to read it, to think about it, to consider it, not to neglect it. And yeah, like in one way, right, the world is obsessed with sex in a very negative, twisted way. But there also is a reality of like sexuality is a huge part of what God made us to be. That there's male and female, that marriage is the most common relationship that male and females will share. And so we want to listen to what God's word has to say about these things, and that it's good. Like anything else, God's good gifts can be perverted. They can be twisted. They can be manipulated, and God condemns that very much. But we want to be careful in talking about those things. So I've always been really careful as a pastor that, particularly even when I was a youth pastor, I often tried not to talk about sex as a bad thing, but as this great thing to be celebrated to young people, because I wanted them to know this is a good thing that God's created, but there's boundaries for it. So I also talked to them about the dangers of why sexual sin in particular can be so dangerous. And Proverbs has a lot to say about that as well. But it is a big part of who God made us to be. And Song of Solomon speaks to that. But you'll meet some people who kind of try to make it, frankly, like less sexual than it is. And I'm like, just stop. Just stop. Like literally the first command or maybe second, that God ever commanded was fill the earth with people. You two, I brought you a wife, and now this is what you're going to do. You're going to enjoy each other, and you're going to fill this world with people. So that was God's first command, and it's a good thing. And I think it's a command that's still in place for those who are married, but even the new covenant, it's fascinating what Jesus says about being single and how that can even transcend that. And for some people, that's what God has for them, and that can be a really good thing because of the gospel and the way that's transformed everything, including the original creation. And so both sexual relationships and marriage are to be celebrated, but also singleness is to be celebrated and can be a great thing as well.